So I'd like to begin by introducing briefly our roundtable participants. This will be very brief. We've had a lot of introducing already, and we want to get to the meat of this. So quickly, we have Romina Boccia, is the Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute. And she has recently written this fine book, which she'll be discussing soon. There it is. Here we have Joshua Priess, who's a teaching associate professor of public policy and core faculty in philosophy, politics, and economics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Here we have Chris Freiman, who's a philosopher, but also a professor of business at the John Chambers College of Business and Economics, and is the director of outreach for the Kendrick Center for an Ethical Economy there at WVU. And finally, but certainly not least of all, we have Lisa Gennetian, who is the Pritzker Professor of Early Learning Policy Studies at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. I hope you'll look up more details, but these lists of accomplishments are long, and I'm not going to go through them now because we need to get to the values we're here to discuss. So let me begin sort of thematically with the Declaration and the Constitution. The themes for this year have all been chosen in connection with those documents since this is 2026. The Declaration was, of course, proclaimed in 1776. So let's start with the Declaration. So the Declaration of Independence famously proclaims that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then just a few lines later, we read that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect, their safety and happiness. So there in the Declaration, we have an affirmation of both liberty on the one hand and also safety or happiness on the other. And then 11 years later, the new US Constitution further affirmed these rights in the preamble's call to both secure the blessings of liberty and to promote the general welfare, which reasons sort of along the same lines that we saw there in the Declaration. So some people in American history have seen these values as being in conflict with one another to some degree or at some times, since efforts to secure safety and happiness may seem and perhaps often have restricted liberty in some regards, right? And increases in liberty may seem to come at the cost of safety and happiness, right? But others have seen these values as complementary, right? Thinking that increases in well-being of the kind that we care most about are perhaps conducive to or even necessary for the kind of liberty we ought to care most about. So before going into any specifics of policy, philosophy, history, and all the things we'll talk about here tonight, I'd like to invite each of you to briefly reflect on these underlying values of liberty and safety in the abstract, and if you wish, as applied to your thinking about safety nets and policy of that kind. And I especially invite you to consider the distinction which often comes up in these discussions between positive and negative conceptions of liberty and how they interact with the value of welfare and safety. And I'll say before I kick it off, I want to see you disagree with each other, right? This is not sort of just a roundtable sharing where we all, just say what we think and nod. I want to see you give and receive reasons, right? This is meant to be, you're facing each other because we're supposed to face each other in the give and take. So I encourage that. I'll cut it off if it gets too rowdy, but I would love to see that happen. So with that said, I'd like to invite one of you to jump in. Who'd like to start?
I'll start.
Yeah.
So I'm an economist by training. My training does not usually come or does not come with a training around normative values, right? The strength of economics is to bring some science, some prediction, some simulation to think about options and trade-offs. So as I was thinking about this question, my head directly went to they're neither. I don't see them in the way that I've been trained as conflicts or complements. I see them as goals, right, of society. And if we want to hold them in tandem, then we have to think about the trade-offs. How do we think about policy and circumstances? How do we think about the economy and what the net benefits are and what the net costs are? How do we weigh those against each other? And then where does that leave us in terms of weighting each of these? And it might be that we're holding both of them, I think, in this balance, and economics offers a framework for thinking about that.
Lisa, could you just
Introduce myself?
yeah, just so that
Oh, before we speak?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
Lisa Gennetian.
Hi, okay. I'm Joshua Priess. Yeah, introducing myself. Let's see. It sounded like. I don't know if it's useful or not, but it might be interesting since this is framed as a 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence to kind of get in the idiom a little bit of the Declaration of Independence. Like, what does it mean to declare independence, and in what sense? In particular, to think about sort of what we might think of as the Republican political philosophy that played a central role in thinking about the Declaration of Independence, right? So when the colonists declared independence, they were declaring a certain sort of freedom, the freedom that befitted a citizen of a republic. And what does that mean? That means, one, you shouldn't be dominated by your fellow citizens or other participants in civil society. You shouldn't be subject to their arbitrary power. If laws govern you or govern other people's lives, they should be accountable to you. Right. So the colonists knew, and at the time, the crown was not taxing the colonies hardly at all. And they knew if revolution happened, if independence happened, they'd be taxed substantially more for no other reason to pay off the debt. Right. But the argument was not so much to avoid a certain restriction of their, to put it this way, negative liberty to not be taxed or to keep their resources, but rather that if laws were going to govern them collectively, they ought to be decided by them and accountable to them in a particular way. And so for students who remember your high school or middle school civics, no taxation without representation would be the way of thinking about that. And why that's one of the reasons why that's sort of relevant to not just the history of genesis of this speaker series, but also from that conception, there's a real strong sort of link between the general welfare, security, and freedom. Particularly if an individual is going to be free, or if a collective, a country is going to be free, they need to be secure in a certain sort of way to not be dependent. And for Hamilton, that meant we had to develop, public capacity. We had to develop manufacturing and all sorts of other things that made that possible, and other founding figures. But also, if you're going to be secure in that way, your people need to be doing well. Right. So part of the sort of Republican foundation here is that there's a really strong connection between government capacity, the ability to do these things, and individual enterprise. And that link was there to provide security for the colonies so that they weren't continuously dominated by manufacturing powerhouses like England or France at the day. And so for me, in that idiom, in that context, there's a real sort of mutual reinforcing quality to general welfare, security, and individual liberty.
Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in.
This is Romina.
Yeah, Romina Boccia. I'm Director of Federal Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute, also trained in economics and originally from Germany, so have experience with the welfare state and social safety nets in Europe as well. So what sprung to my mind is the way in which the courts have interpreted the general welfare clause, and I think overly widely, in a way where Congress has been empowered to institute just about any law with very few limits on the actual exercise of federal government power. And I think it's made us worse off as a country. When I think of our sister Republic of Switzerland, it is based on a very similar structure where you're supposed to have a limited central government, and then most affairs are handled on the private, state or local level. And we've really moved away from that in U.S. history, especially after the Great Depression, with the implementation of Social Security as the very first welfare program in the United States, and then expanding from there, where the power to tax was interpreted so broadly as that it allowed the federal government to assume just about any power that up until that point had been considered reserved for the private sphere or state and local governments. And I say that it's made us worse off because many affairs, especially when it comes to the complex needs of the poor and the more vulnerable among us, are not best met by a far away centralized bureaucracy, but are best met by people with local knowledge on the ground, local knowledge of their communities, of their economies. A lot of the pathologies that we observe in the United States today are in part a result of government policy that has raised taxes excessively high in order to provide absurdly large benefits in highly complex ways that undermine individual agency, undermine work, undermine family formation, and that's led to many social pathologies that then new government programs are instituted to try and solve. So that's what I was thinking more of, is how the general welfare has been interpreted and the public policies it has led to and how these are impacting us.
Dan, I don't think we're gonna have any trouble arguing today. I think it's gonna be fun.
Well,
Anyway,
really-
Chris, sorry, go ahead.
I'm Chris Freiman. I'm a political philosopher, probably provide a different perspective than the other panelists. I would just say, though, as an empirical matter of fact, it seems to me like there's not a great conflict between the general welfare and liberty and rights. I mean, when you look at the most prosperous, happiest countries on earth, they do a pretty good job of respecting economic and civil liberties. But of course, they won't always harmonize. There will be conflicts. And my own view, which I guess I won't defend right now, but probably will as we get into it, is that you can sometimes override individual rights and liberties for the sake of the general welfare. But the welfare gain has to be really big. Just to take a couple of examples, you have the right of bodily autonomy. You get to do with your body what you please. Abstracting away from any particular case, everybody's going to think of COVID when I say this, but I don't want to talk about COVID. But you could, in principle, mandate, in my view, a vaccine to prevent the spread of a very deadly disease. Whether COVID, like I said, let's not talk about COVID. But like if that meets the bar or not, we could discuss. But the idea is that that's not a small, trivial benefit. That's a huge benefit. And that might be enough to justify overriding that individual right of bodily autonomy. You have the right of occupational choice. Nobody can tell you what career you can take. What if World War II breaks out and we have to institute a military draft? Then we can probably restrict people's rights of occupational choice. Again, maybe. We probably can't restrict your right of occupational choice just to boost economic growth a little bit. You want to go to, I don't know, a monastery and become a monk and meditate. You say, no, we can boost GDP by like forcing you to work in the financial sector. We can't do that. We can't do that. And so this is also how I think about sort of safety nets and redistribution of property rights. If you think that people have property rights, then generally speaking, there's a very strong moral presumption against violating those property rights. And I think taxation for the sake of redistribution is a violation of people's property rights. Does that mean they could never be overridden? No. Surely I think you can violate someone's property rights to, say, save a life. If you have to steal a life preserver to save someone from drowning, I say do it. That's right. But can you steal somebody's refrigerator or their television, even if you would benefit more from that television than they would? So there's a slight boost in the general welfare. Probably not. So that's kind of the framework that I use to evaluate these questions. There's a very strong moral presumption against the violation of rights, including property rights. And the burden is on those who would say, all right, this particular policy, it will violate property rights or restrict property rights. The burden is on that person to show that the gain to the general welfare is sufficiently large to justify that rights violation.
Okay, so I'm going to give it a quick chance for some back and forth. I'm going to encourage more back and forth with this next topic, but would anyone like to jump into the fray here before I move us along?
Well, I think it'd be useful I think everybody's for property rights, but there's lots of questions lurking in the idea of what counts as property rights. Like how long of a duration is intellectual property? Does tax in general violate property rights? Do you have a violation of property right if you change the restrictions of trade, if you do sign a free trade agreement, if you don't sign a free trade agreement? And there's a myriad of in some discourses you might think of as pre-distributive or structural sources of what then leads to various forms of distribution, right? So, for example, if you pursue a growth-oriented trade agreement, right, and that has distributive consequences that substantially concentrates benefits with some people do better, some people do a little bit better, some people do a little bit worse, just as Ricardo all the way through would predict. And then you say, well, we want to redistribute some of that wealth in order to make it a mutually beneficial thing. Is that a violation of someone's property rights? Or is that just a way of efficiently putting into practice this trade policy, right? And so for me, it doesn't help a whole lot. Because I think a lot of times when people talk about property rights, they talk about it as though we all have some fixed idea of notion, like I made something and it's mine, right? But most of the business of public policy isn't about deciding that. It's about deciding all sorts of other things that provide the structure of gains to begin with, including how secure and how insecure someone is, right? So I prefer to focus on those things rather than maybe redistributive taxation, safety net per se, but in any event.
I would just say that doesn't differentiate property rights from other sorts of rights. So there's ambiguity in sort of how we exercise and define the boundaries of any right. So like freedom of speech, but just to take a controversial example, we could say, does the right of bodily autonomy permit, let's say, abortion? That's a big debate. And, that's not something that we're going to resolve here. But the fact that there's ambiguity in how we define the boundaries of a right doesn't mean that sort of the framework of thinking about that right is sort of unilluminating. So in other words, I don't think that property rights are particularly more ambiguous than other kinds of rights that we invoke in public policy discourse.
I mean, thinking about the status quo distribution is what I am entitled to by virtue of it being the status quo distribution.
But that's also not my view.
I know, yeah.
The table, or do you want to go on to the next?
Challenge and then we move on. So
Okay.
last word.
All right. I don't think it should be the last word.
Um,
But I guess the challenge in the table, I'm hearing this conversation about property rights and individual rights. And I wonder if the reframing of what is the private sphere and what is the public sphere, and how do we think about public goods in this conversation of property rights? How does that intersect?
Yeah.
We've been very focused on the individual, right? In the context of this.
So
trade-off.
I agree very much. That's good to put on the table. That'll actually dovetail nicely with our next topic of discussion. So I want to turn to history. Okay. So over the course of US history, and of course, history elsewhere, liberty and safety and or happiness have interwoven in complex ways. And these interactions have been subject to intense political and ideological contestation. So, for example, during the 1980s and 1990s, the American economy and many other economies underwent significant deregulation, right? And the United States did not end up adopting European-style safety net programs that had looked pretty likely during the 1970s, at least more likely. Some saw this as a win for both liberty and happiness, while critics to the left saw this as a foolish sacrifice of happiness and security for the sake of some kind of, Wild West notion of liberty, or maybe harsher terms were used also, right? So I'd like us to, like each of you to reflect on the relationship between liberty, happiness, and security on the one hand, and social safety nets at particular moments in history. What lessons about these matters should we draw from our past? Some possibilities to get you going. We're not limited to these, but might include, for instance, the progressive movement at the beginning of the 20th century, the roughly contemporaneous so-called Lochner era of conservative jurisprudence, the New Deal and the birth of social security. Romina, I know you might have something to say about social security.
Don't get me started.
The passage of the Affordable Care Act, which is also known more colloquially as Obamacare, and its subsequent and ongoing turmoil, and the Biden administration's very recent failed attempt at mass student debt forgiveness are some examples from American history that might bring these themes to bear. So with that, I'll let the discussion begin.
If you're budget wonks too, you might have heard that the Congressional Budget Office put out its new baseline today, also this called the Budget and Economic Outlook. And you might be surprised to learn, if you haven't had a chance to dig into that document yet, that over the next 10 years, the following spending categories, most of which are entitlement programs, and then one is a spending category, will consume 100% of all tax revenues. By 2036, interest on the debt, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I haven't named defense. I haven't named veterans benefits. I haven't named most federal government agencies. Just those healthcare entitlements and Social Security plus interest on the debt will consume 100% of our tax revenues, which means that we would have to borrow the entire amount that we would want to spend on national defense and everything else. We are in a highly unsustainable fiscal trajectory as a result, not of, things the government wants to do, as a result of redistribution, and not redistribution that's based on need. For the most part, if you look at the federal budget, the means tested, the welfare programs that are for poor people that need support make up a small and in fact declining share of the budget, especially if you consider them as a share of the budget or as a share of GDP. What's been growing are the more universal entitlements that are provided based on age, regardless of need. And the biggest ones there are Social Security and Medicare. There's another interesting government report called the Financial Report of the United States Government that the Treasury puts out annually in February. And Congress doesn't like to talk about that one because the CBO report that I just mentioned only looks at 10 years. Well, the next 10 years are looking really bad. But the Financial Report of the United States Government actually looks over the next 75 years. So it's not like what's happening now is coming as a surprise. Not at all. We've known that these programs are unsustainable for decades. In fact, the Social Security actuaries in 1983, the year after Social Security was last reformed, were saying that it wasn't sufficient, that the program wouldn't be sustainable. And now it's projected to run out of money by 2032. In fact, it's already run out of money, but that's a different topic, where seniors could face automatic benefit cuts of 24%, regardless of their income or other assets. That's the default we face. But that long-term report shows that the entire unfunded obligation of the United States government, which is the gap between what we're projected to spend and what we will collect in taxes, is due to Social Security and Medicare, and politicians don't want to talk about it. They pretend that these benefits have been paid for. They use all kinds of nice-sounding rhetoric about earned benefits, about contributions, about trust funds. But if you actually look at how these programs work, they don't work unlike Medicaid or food stamps. It's just that they're vastly larger and vastly more expensive and don't meet any economically justified or morally justified need. It's just redistribution, pure and simple, from younger working Americans to the older generations because they are politically powerful.
All right, so we have, a pretty ambiguous take here on Social Security. Maybe we can, no, I'm kidding. Who'd like to jump in?
Well, this is going to be so much of debate. It's going to be agreement, which is going to be very interesting, I think. Agreement on a number of things that you just named, Romina, because coming from Mike, I do a lot of work thinking about families and children. And I appreciate the naming of where our spending goes. And how we've been maybe thoughtful, maybe overcorrected on redistribution on age. We can debate that. I want to pick up on two things that you said that has not come up yet. Social Security depends on tax revenue. Tax revenue depends on earnings and other sources of income. there are a few dramatic shifts that have happened in our country. We are getting old and older. Our younger population is much fewer, right? So we have a real demographic challenge that we're facing as a country that we still don't know how to reckon with, right? There's simply just going to be fewer people, fewer younger people. I know you're all here and we look forward to your contributions to Social Security, but there's not enough of you. So that's one enormous shift. And the other I want to bring to the table is immigration. You know, immigrants are contributors. They're another way of sort of solving or thinking about the demographic challenge ahead of us. And so how do they factor into this whole spending dilemma, and who's getting benefits at what age and who's being included and excluded? I think there's maybe some alignment and interesting discussion so I'm going to invite our two other colleagues to talk about that. Or to build on.
I mean, it's not just an American concern here, right? The demographics combined with slower growth, combined with asset growth versus labor growth, and having most of the funding for these mechanisms coming through labor. There's a variety of structural reasons why Social Security, as it's currently structured, is running into some issues. And more generally, to highlight your point, why the budgets are increasingly tilted towards seniors. You know, like we basically are redistributing from poor working class from families to seniors. And I don't think anyone at this table is going to defend, I might be wrong, is going to defend that as like either the most just or the most efficient or even the most public good thing to do. I think you could make that distinction and still think that having Social Security as a mechanism is a useful social thing. There's a reason why, you know, basically every wealthy country, every wealthy democratic country, as it's become wealthier, has expanded spending on these things, right? The collective insurance function is sort of built into the efficiency of these programs, right? But there is a real political power, there's a real political economy issue with how we're dealing with this demographic crisis that I think is related to, but can be also separated from like a general point about the extent to which Social Security can further freedom or the general good or whatnot.
I do hate Social Security, for the record. So just just as an initial point, there are two. Oh, I know, I'm not subtle or nuanced. So I think there are two conflicting rationale, well, not conflicting, but two different rationales for Social Security. And I don't think either one actually justifies Social Security. One is a paternalistic rationale. The idea is that, I know you guys are the high school kids, you guys, it's like, oh, you're going to enter the workforce and you're just not going to save enough for retirement. I'm not saying that, but you know, the government might be thinking that. And so for your own good, we will institute Social Security so that you have income in retirement because we don't trust you to save enough. So that's one argument for Social Security, but I actually don't think that's a good argument for Social Security. If anything, it's an argument for something like mandated private retirement savings. And there are other countries that have systems like this. So the government can just say, you have to put X amount in a retirement fund when you're 22 or whatever. And so if you're worried about people not saving enough for retirement, don't impose Social Security, just force people to save for retirement. There's a second rationale for Social Security, which is it's a kind of progressive redistribution. It cuts down elder poverty. Okay, that's fair. But then I would say, insofar as the justification for Social Security is that it functions as a form of progressive redistribution, don't make the target the elderly. Make the target people in poverty. So rich people also get Social Security. And so if the rationale for Social Security is that it helps the poor as they age, I say, okay, fine, but just get rid of Social Security and get programs that actually target the poor.
Let me introduce another possible rationale that's germane to our discussion today. What about freedom, right? Do we need something like Social Security to be free in some relevant sense? So you might think that you need that to be free in the Republican sense of free from some kind of dependence. You might think that you need something like Social Security to be free in something like Franklin Delano Roosevelt's sense of these four four freedoms, including freedom from want. Right? So there has been in the history of political thought in America freedom-based defenses of programs like and including Social Security. I'd love to know what you think of those defenses. Any of you?
Well, I invoke the Republican part, so I suppose I should answer to the Republican answer. I mean, I think insecurity is clearly a central threat to freedom on any Republican in this case doesn't map particularly well onto the current Republican Party in the United States, but it does map pretty well onto that party at its founding, and more generally, just thinking about what it would mean for an individual to be free, right? So one of the virtues of the Republican approach in this sense is that it takes power seriously in a certain sort of way, and it recognizes that insecurity is a central form of threat to that kind of liberty. But I think social safety nets can be useful to mitigate a sort of a certain amount of like obvious insecurities. But I think social safety nets work less well from a Republican perspective than just as a decency humanity perspective. From a Republican perspective, what you would need is something that would provide something closer to a middle class existence, which you're not going to get from that kind of redistributive program, right? It requires a certain kind of inclusive growth as opposed to just a social safety net.
I think we can argue this theoretically, or we can look at what's actually happening. And what's happening is that the major entitlement programs, federal health care, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, and Social Security are making us more insecure and weakening our republic and putting us at grave risk of a severe fiscal crisis, including potentially toppling the dollar as the global reserve currency. And we wouldn't be the first or only country to lose our global role, lose our economic strength, and lose our currency, not just as a global reserve currency, but the dollar as the currency that we use to exchange in the United States due to excessive social spending. This is what happened to the UK after World War II. The pound used to be what the dollar is today. It is no more. And the numbers I threw out earlier, these programs are highly unsustainable. Theoretically, we can debate whether we need them in some limited form to protect against economic insecurity, but that's not how these programs are designed or structured or the purpose that they currently serve. And if we don't reform these programs and cut them back and curtail them, and more importantly, adopt a limiting budget constraint on our representatives who've been all too willing to indebt younger and future generations in order to secure votes today and in the past, we're not going to have much of a republic to protect for the long term.
Yeah, just quickly. So I would say money is necessary for freedom. So if you don't have money, you're not free to, I don't know, consume I don't know if you have a McDonald's in here, but, buy a Big Mac and consume it. You're not free to buy a car if you don't have money. But then there's this question of whether or not Social Security is an efficient way of getting money in the hands of people who need it. Probably not for the reasons I mentioned. But just briefly on this issue of security, I think, so earlier Professor Lehman talked a little bit about Europe, because Europe is a lot poorer than the United States. Like median income in the United States is much, much higher than it is in Europe. And one reason for that is that a lot of European countries have taken, something like job security too far. So for example, you might say, oh, if I get hired for a job and it's almost impossible to fire me for the first 2 years of my employment, you might think that's great. But on the other hand, that might make an employer reluctant to hire you in the first place. So here's an analogy. The government passes a law and they say, if you go on one date with someone, you cannot break up with them for 2 years. You might not go on a first date. And so maybe it's not like conducive to like a dynamic economy to have that much protection. And so I think the trade-off between security and money and economic growth is very real in a way that can ultimately be self-defeating because, like I said, like having money is freedom and having money is security. So if you're retired and you have millions of dollars in your 401k, that gets you a lot of security. And the really big regulatory and redistributive states that we have in Europe can be antithetical to you getting yourself in that sort of economic position in the first place.
I mean, one thing we haven't talked a lot about is who is benefiting and who is not. I mean, we've implicitly talked about it or abstractly theoretically talked about it. And age has certainly played into this and demographic transitions, but, we haven't really reckoned with other population segments of the population that have been held to the front and the forefront of the design of many of these policies, and many have been left behind.
Would you like to?
Should we have that conversation? I'm going to frame this in the way of unintended consequences. And I don't think there is one policy in the US, certainly not in the social safety net in the way that we've been talking about, that is not baked in some criteria, whether it's eligibility criteria, whether it's something complicated about family structure, residential status, whether you have an address. I mean, we could go down a very proof of some documentation that differs quite a bit across states. How do we reckon with that? Those are real elements of exclusion and insecurity and lack of freedom and lack of rights.
Absolutely. And this next question, I think, will actually follow nicely on that. So we've sort of by accident started talking about policy anyway. I tried to make us talk about history, but we just talked about policy. So that's fine. We're going to keep talking about policy.
You invited the wrong people.
Yeah. So the next question is this. If you, as each of you, could make just one major change to American policy insofar as it relates to liberty, security, and safety nets, what would it be and why?
I've been thinking about this one a lot because the challenge that I am trying to solve for is how do we avoid a severe fiscal crisis in the United States, especially now that we're already in a debt crisis. I say we're already in a debt crisis because our debt is as large as the size of the entire US economy. And at those high rates, and especially debt that's growing, is dragging down economic growth. So I think that is a debt crisis. What the other reason I say we're in a debt crisis is because we're now spending more on interest on our debt than on national defense. That is a crisis. So what's the one thing I would do? It would actually, so I wrote a book about Social Security, so you should definitely read it. But I would actually fix Medicare, because Medicare is by far the larger driver of our debt crisis than Social Security. With Social Security, you go from an average of 4% of GDP spending in recent years to about 6%. And then you kind of level off because we go through the baby boom and then we're through the decline in fertility, and then we just have a larger program. We can debate whether we want a more expensive Social Security program or whether there are better uses of that money. But with Medicare, we have no idea if that cost curve is ever going to bend. Right now, Medicare is growing and has been over the past 50 years that it's been around at a rate 1.5 times the rate of the economy. So we can't grow our way out of it. As we've become wealthier, people consume more healthcare. As there's more innovations, more drugs, more treatments available, usage has gone up, and there's no budget for Medicare spending. And so the change I would institute is it goes twofold. One, we could convert Medicare into something like Social Security, give people the cash directly, give it to them in a health savings account. Other people have recommended vouchers. They don't trust people with money, so they want to attach more strings to it. But what you do when you do that is that you actually put a limit on how much Medicare will spend. You give it a budget. That's the first step. And then once you have a budget, now you need to make trade-offs. You need to prioritize. That's what a budget constraint does. And so who should make those trade-offs? Who should decide what treatments you can get, when you can get them, et cetera? I think that the patient, the individual should be in that position. I think that's the best solution here. And so if you give people cash, you solve for both issues. There's a budget and you empower the individual to consume healthcare in line with their own wishes and desires. My colleague Michael Cannon, who's our healthcare expert, made a really interesting point that I hadn't considered before. And that's if you have a chronic disease that you know will kill you, and perhaps you don't have that much time left, it's like, how do you maximize value out of the resources available to you? And when it comes to Medicare, it is treatments. It is getting more medical treatments, where if you had that cash available to you in a health savings account, you might decide, gosh, I have 2 months to live. Do I want to spend it in a hospital, or do I want to take my family on a cruise?
Next.
I feel like there's a lot of premises both within the debt conversation and within the healthcare policy conversations that I kind of don't want to just leave there, but I feel like I'm going to do it anyway because I don't want to get bogged down in a certain sort of conversation. But I mean, what I would say is the policy that I would have to further security would be investment and jobs oriented policy that was growth oriented rather than social security oriented, rather than safety net oriented. I mean, I've in my previous book, Just Work for All, and the book I'm working on, other things, I've talked about all sorts of different specifics, and I'm a little less inclined to say that, but something like a full employment orientation within government policy would be what I would say. I think because the kind, for both a Republican but just in general perspective, insecurity threatens people not because of insecurity of destitution necessarily, but insecurity of losing their place in society and their place in the economy. Right? They're not being included in society, and a lot of our policy models have not been very in tune to thinking about the importance of social and economic inclusion, both geographically and across the labor market. And I think that there's a lot that the government, combined with public-private partnerships, could do to make the economy much more inclusive. And people would feel more secure, not because they can't be fired, which is like a recipe for insecurity, right? Or a recipe for pitting older workers against younger workers, essentially, which is why in a lot of European countries, right-wing populism is a younger person's thing, right? But also, because the most way to be secure is to be not necessarily just from the private sector, not necessarily just from government, but to feel secure in your ability to command a certain amount of wage and status for your labor. And that should be the central goal of our economic policy.
So do you imagine something like the government as an employer of last resort, or something of that kind?
I think a full a jobs guarantee or a full employment policy would be part of it. I think you could orient monetary policy to deal counter-cyclical issues much differently than we do. And there's a wide range of other things that I would advocate for. But a jobs guarantee, and against the public policy, the devil is in the details, and I have details, but that would be a speech. So I would just say, yeah, that would be my policy. Yeah.
This is one of the disadvantages of maybe my choices. Yeah, but now I want to write a book. So thank you for motivating me. I'm wondering two things. I am struck that we don't want to talk about health outside of the important spending lens that was just put forth. To me, if we think about needs, safety, security, health feels quite foundational to that. So how do we think about that? Access, cost, quality of treatment, choice, all the things. The Affordable Care Act, I feel like, has been sort of an accessory that was the only option after lots and lots of maybe terrible to maybe okay options on the way. So how do we think about that? The other thing that I want to kind of push back on, my understanding from literature is full employment is an aspiration. I mean, this has been held in high regard across the world. And my understanding is that it is not an achievable goal, in part because not everyone, right, can be fully employed, even if the job were available to them. So we are getting back to the populations that maybe, right, can't translate their capacity into paid work.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think anyone, well, anyway, I don't think any like active jobs guarantee full employment program. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just what's the orientation of fiscal and monetary policy? How are you structuring tax law? How are you touching all these different micro decisions that governments have to make when they structure a modern economy that shape the incentives in a certain sort of way? That's, yeah.
Yeah, so just two quick thoughts. So back to this idea that money is freedom and money is security, to keep money in your pocket, you want to make life affordable. And what's the biggest affordability problem facing Americans today? And it's housing. And so like, why is housing so expensive? It's because there are lots of rules and regulations about building housing. It's not easy to build housing. And so as prices rise for any good, you would expect suppliers to flood in and create more of that thing to get more money. And so you say, well, why with housing prices so high, aren't we building more houses and bringing the cost down? Well, it's just because it's virtually impossible. That's an overstatement, but it's very, very hard to build new housing in the United States, in part because communities can veto housing projects that they don't like, and people aren't able to build housing on their own property, these sorts of things. So that would actually, it wouldn't even be a safety net issue. It would just let developers build housing, drive down the price of housing so you all can afford a house once you graduate from college. In terms of a safety net, and I think this speaks to your point about access, this is not politically feasible, but I do theory. I'm a philosopher. I don't know about the real world. That's why I took this job. Is just replace the whole thing with the UBI. So So universal basic income, you basically just, I would say send checks in the mail, but we don't do that anymore. But like electronically send money each month, whatever, to every single person in the US. You say, wait, that's not targeting the poor. And I thought you wanted to target the poor. That's true. But the idea is that you can make it progressive on the tax end. So you could say everybody, Elon Musk included, gets this money in their bank account every month, but we tax Elon more than everyone else. And so even though everybody's getting the same amount deposited each month, the wealthy are paying more than the poor to fund this program. So I would replace the whole thing, Social Security, Medicaid, SNAP, all this stuff. Just give people money.
Have you looked at the recent literature on UBI experiments? Because some of them aren't very positive. There's like significant declines in labor force participation and just a complete substitution of the amount when it's, a test of, say, people get $2,000 a month and then they stop working and et cetera. Like,
yeah.
Even without all of the strings attached, it seems to discourage work,
Yeah.
is my point.
Yeah, universal basic income. I guess 2 points. It might be true there might be some cutbacks in work. And I think the question then to pose is what else is being done with that time? Some of that time could go into productive activity, including caring for children, caring for other people in the household, investing in education. I think some of those studies are showing that. I'm not disagreeing that cutbacks in employment and earnings is an important question on the table. The second thing I want to raise, and this has been argued with me around UBI and replacement. I think what you have said has actually been proposed, actually. Yeah, we have some.
There are a few of us.
Government officials who've said, let's just get rid of all of it. Let's all replace it with this cash-based systems. It's a very demand-based approach. So the two, I think, dilemmas to put on the table there is it means it's very subject to risk of getting cut and demolished based on one decision, right? Like based on one philosophy of particular congressional members, a certain administration. And so that is the risk, right? If we put everything into our entire social safety net into the hands of one mechanism, what does that mean? How does that intersect with our political economy? So put that out there. It also assumes that supply will respond evenly. And I worry about that, right?
So just briefly, I would actually have the opposite worry, is not that it would shrink, is that it would actually grow too big. The reason being, think think about how responsive the senior population is to changes in Social Security. Like they want their Social Security checks. Like, I don't blame them. Like, so you guys got to get to work. Like there's got to be some Social Security left when I retire. Yeah, for us, exactly. You guys shouldn't even be here right now. Please start studying. But so the idea is if you're getting this check every month, every 2 weeks, whatever, and there's a politician who cuts it back, and their opponent is running attack ads. They're saying they cut your check by 20%. Vote for me, who will restore it. I actually think that's probably the winning message. But then I think like that maybe the risk, and this might just be a difference in sort of our I don't know, like normative priors or ideological priors, like that might actually even ratchet up. So like this person wants to keep it at the status quo. I want to bump it up by 15%. Vote for me. And so the worry is that my worry is it might actually get too big. But I will say to your point, like, yeah, those studies, they give me pause. Like, I think a lot of the really optimistic expectations that people had for the UBI just have not panned out. And so my view is the best we can do is pick the least bad option. Maybe these show that the UBI is not the least bad option, but
The second.
could be the second best option. Yeah. Well, at least, but yeah.
Well, here's a thought though. What if these purported defects or bugs of UBIs are actually features, right? And not bugs, right? So take
Competition in the labor market?
so take workforce participation, right? One ground on which some people defend UBIs is that this can create genuine exit options, not just from particular employment situations, but from the labor market, right? That this is finally going to reduce not just domination with respect to a single employer, but domination with respect to the demand that you work for a boss. So some might say that was the point, right? We're seeing people now do this thing that was unavailable to them at the cost of their freedom prior to the UBI. What about that kind of defense?
Well, I think that defense is really useful. I've argued, and you probably know this, that Milton Friedman and Friedmanites should make that defense because their understanding of markets is being non-coercive entities, right? I think a more plausible way of thinking of markets is to take power more seriously in a way than that. But I think the better way to do it in that structure would be less to have an unconditional basic income. I have UBI friends, including, and so I'm not gonna, and I think there could be a place for it. But I think more like an economy that's creating a certain sort of demand for labor combined with structures for countervailing power is actually more politically feasible. And it's also more consistent with what people actually want, which is the status that comes from a certain sort of work, which is being included, which is, it's very different than what UBI could provide, even in its sort of idealized form.
The economic stability, which is another thing that UBI could provide, right? As a package, as a bundle of what you're talking about.
About how a UBI would be financed and where the money comes from, because government doesn't just have money lying around to send us all checks. Yeah, it's getting it from workers. And so that you have to consider the distortionary impact. And if you actually had a broad-based UBI, you couldn't do the math. It's going to be way more expensive than our current welfare state.
So just two quick thoughts. So I think there are two costs to the people withdrawing from the labor market. One is just it's going to slow economic growth. And people really underestimate the impact of even small changes to the growth rate. So the reason why you guys are like the richest people in the history of the world, which is true, like you're in the 0.0001% in the history of the world, is not because of a safety net. It's because of economic growth. And even small changes to the growth rate over the course of your lifetime can change your lifetime earnings by millions of dollars. And so to me, this is a big worry about the UBI. If it slows growth, that could actually leave you with less money in your pocket over the course of your life. So that's one worry. And the second worry is I do kind of have an ethical worry. So the person is like, I'm withdrawn from the labor market entirely to go surfing. It's like, well, it's not very fair if I'm working a job and paying taxes, so this guy can go surfing and he's not going to reciprocate by working and paying taxes of his own. That doesn't seem very fair to me. So I once was in a debate about the UBI, and my interlocutor said, "You are the least enthusiastic defender of a UBI I have ever debated." I was like, "Yeah, that's probably like yeah."
Just wondering how many people you know who would prefer surfing over having any earnings over
I
their
don't.
lifetime.
I don't associate with people who would spend their time surfing.
So we have only 4 minutes left in the primary pre-question part of our program. So I want to give each of you a very quick closing statement opportunity. So how would you like to leave our participants today prior to the Q&A? So let's just go around.
Well, I'm delighted that Davidson College has this $4 million grant, because I know I've learned a lot from this conversation, and in my circles, the conversation that doesn't often happen is this intersection of debt and financing and well-being. More of that to get to a place that is a balance, again, balance, net gain, and thinking hard about inclusiveness as part of that.
I would second that. I think this is just such a great forum, and I really appreciate the disciplinary and ideological diversity of the panel. I think that's great. And I think this worked out really well. So sometimes I've been in interdisciplinary debates and like we're just talking past each other because we're talking a different language. And I don't think that happened here. I think it was really productive. And just in terms of the content of the debate or the discussion, I would say, you could look at safety nets sort of as safety nets. They're sort of like the icing on the economic cake. But like the cake itself, like the main course is not the safety net. It's not the redistribution. It's policies that grow the economy and make life more affordable.
On the fiscal front, I would say that the good news is that we are so wealthy as a country that we can reform these major entitlement programs without doing undue harm. And that's really good news, but we still need to do it. On the dialogue that we are having here and that DCI is advancing, I think it's really important that when you hear something that you disagree with, that you think about your reaction, and rather than feel defensive or angry about something, don't get furious, get curious. And I think that's something we can all benefit from, because then it can allow us to grapple with the real challenges that we face by confronting them and challenging each other's assumptions and inquiring about what's going on.
So healthcare policy and Medicare is a disaster in terms of spending. But I do think that a lot of what the challenge, and actually more or less agreeing with Chris here. First of all, that's an amazing program. Thank you for the questions. Thanks for everybody. That the issue for security is less just about safety nets, although I think safety nets are important. And I think applying safety nets in a way that they're not so fragmented that some people get benefits and some people don't. So I have some concerns with the hyper-federalism, I guess. But nonetheless, I think it's fundamentally a growth story, but it's not just a growth story. It's an inclusive growth story, right? And I think we have reasons to both really, I have very little space for degrowthers or any, I think that raises political distributional issues that are intractable. I think that growth is essential, but I think it's also important that the path of technological development is such that it's more conducive to inclusive growth, both between different types of workers and in between different places. And I do think there is some reason to be worried that we're on a current path of economic development, which is going to continue to hyper concentrate resources. And that's going to inevitably lead to budget shortfalls, among other things, because of how we get our funding. So I think we need to be really intentional collectively and individually about how we structure our growth, and not just think that both recognizing that growth is essential to security, but also that different paths of growth can be a lot more or less secure.
Whether or not you are furious, I hope you're curious, because it is time for Q&A. So let's thank our speakers and transition.
Yeah, thank you all for a great talk. How, if at all, would the prospect of AI and automation displacing like a significant chunk of the American workforce affect your prescriptions today?
So, I mean, I'm actually sort of an AI optimist. So, I mean, if you just look at major technological advancements in history, they've increased productivity. They've increased supply of goods. They've driven down the price. So like mechanized agriculture, like I don't know the number. It was like at one point, like 90% of Americans were like farming or something like that. Now it's like 2%. We just got more efficient at it because we have technology that makes us more efficient. We can produce a lot more food. And if AI makes us more productive and, you know, creates new goods, drives down the price of goods, this is going to generally be good for everyone. Now, if it reaches a point where it's doing everything that's better than us, I don't know what to say. Like we got existential problems at that point. But I mean, some people will be displaced, but I also don't see that as something that is different in kind from technological unemployment in the past, although maybe it is different in degree. So you say, you know, somebody was put out of, so I don't know, Netflix. You guys know Blockbuster Video? You've heard of Blockbuster Video? Okay, I don't know. So Netflix put Blockbuster employees out of work. Does that mean we want to stop Netflix from operating or the creation of Netflix? You say no. You could have something like a UBI. So if you're put out of work as a Blockbuster employee, you have that money as, you know, a safety net to live off of while you look for new employment or something like that. Or maybe you just have unemployment benefits. So it's not a UBI, but if you're out of work, you get 6 weeks of pay from the government, whatever, something like that. But I actually don't think it kind of fundamentally changes the problem, at least not in the immediate term.
Yeah, I do have a question from one of our online participants, Carla, and I'm just going to read her question. Does everyone on the panel agree that the redistribution of wealth, at least in some form, is beneficial to a healthy democracy?
Just one thing on the AI thing. I mean, I do think the digital and platform economy have the concentrations of power are built into it in a way that's different than other parts of the physical economy. And I do feel like that the structure of these particular type of gains, so like AI, because of the potential for productivity gains, it's a great potential for progressive gains. I mean, it's just like you need productivity growth in order to get these gains, in order to get politically achievable gains. However, I think the nature of the economy and the nature of platform economy in general, and AI is kind of this on steroids, is a concentration effect. And I think that because of network effects and the relation thing, I think that this time might be different, not because the technology is so different, but because of it's different in that way. And so I do think you need to reckon with that. And so maybe in that case, redistribution is also called for. But I think more, I mean, I tend to lean towards like what we want to do is structure markets in such a way as that they have more inclusive gains to begin with, rather than to rely on redistribution. But I'm definitely for some redistribution. So I'm going to let other people say if they're for it, against it.
And then maybe we'll go back to wealth. I also am an AI optimist, and I also agree with some of the concerns about concentration. And the thing that for me, though, feels different with AI and tech and automation is it's happening very fast, right? The pace of innovation, I don't think has ever happened before. That's unprecedented. And that's what I think is going to be hard to predict. You know, can we keep getting ahead of it and manage it? Can we regulate quickly enough? Do we need to regulate? And it's just evolving so quickly. I think that's, you know, a big question. And again, who's going to win? Who's going to lose? Is this going to be a net gain for the economy? I thank you, Carla, for bringing up wealth. When I was thinking about transformative policies, my head was going towards wealth and how do we think about wealth distribution, perhaps in addition to kind of distribution of income. And, you know, I think it's been, this is where we can tell the strongest stories probably of inclusion and exclusion intergenerationally, certainly in the US. And we have not reckoned with that. I'll use that word. There you go. I try to give two for one. Romina.
I think it's a very loaded question, and I would have to disagree that it's been a good thing. I think that being charitable is a good thing. I think is helping the poor is a good thing, but wealth redistribution has created more problems than it's solved. And no, I do not agree that it's a good thing.
But I have to say something here. So in early writings on democracy and voting, many people assumed like obviously the property list can't vote, right? Because if they're property list, they're dependent, right? And we can't have someone who is a dependent person be voting in the government. And most 19th century theorists, their conclusion they drew from that was, well, we should limit the franchise, right, to the property. That strikes most of us as not an appropriate option, but we still have to wrestle with whether it's going to be compatible, right, with sort of self-rule to have people participating on terms that are highly dependent on other members of the polity. And that's one reason why you might think that there's some kind of concern about wealth distribution when it comes to democracy.
I have some more from in person. Yeah, right up in the front row.
Well, hi. Thank you guys for speaking today. A lot of you guys took a knock at social programs, kind of. So, like, what social programs or safety nets do you think that are in place today that you would keep and you think are good for our society?
Longer list than I do.
I don't know if it was a knock. I think it was a conversation about sustainability. Romina, am I incorrect or correct? You're not saying get rid of Social Security. You're talking about reforming Social Security.
In my book, I talk about reimagining
Social Security.
Fundamentally redesigning it, restructuring it. If getting rid of it is on the table, I'd be willing to have that.
Right, but replacing it with something.
It's fine to get rid of it. Okay. Yeah, she'd be happy to get rid of it.
All right. So to answer your question, thinking about a different the segment of society that is on the lower end of the income distribution, there are many social programs that have been fundamental and really important for their daily well-being. I'll name food subsidy programs as one example. I'll name, there is a lack of it, but, housing assistance as another example. I'll name WIC, which straddles a little bit of, what's happening in early childhood around nutrition as well as health in those very early years. So we do have really promising examples, inclusive examples, things that work, they're efficient. There's evidence that they have short-term positive effects, long-term positive effects. That should be sustained. So interpreting this conversation as a knock on all social programs, I would argue is not the right interpretation. Do we need reimagination and reform? We should always be asking those questions. That's what I would say.
Clarify that I think we have to raise questions about who provides support and in what form and whether it's reciprocal. I am a fan of charitable organizations. I am a fan of churches and mutual aid societies that provide assistance. And I think they can do it in a more effective way than the abstract, removed bureaucrat in Washington. So when you ask this question, I think of social programs as government programs, and I think they do more harm than good. But that doesn't mean that I don't believe in aid, charity, support, but what form should that take? And I would also like to say I've moved to Utah about 5 years ago, and you see a lot more personal involvement in welfare, in the welfare of individuals. And it is a lot more personalized, and I think it is more effective than some of these programs. And on the note of SNAP, food stamps, 1 out of 10 food stamps dollars is improper. There's an incredible amount of fraud, and there's entire communities that are built around defrauding the federal taxpayers. We've seen several examples of this in the news cycle just in these past few weeks. And I think that in part happens because the aid that's given is so abstract. You have this middleman, the federal government, and people don't see it in many cases as a crime or a bad thing to do, to defraud the government, because they don't think of it as stealing from their neighbors and from their fellow citizens. And I think that's one of the problems with the welfare state, that it's so removed and so abstract, and that the best way to support each other and help each other is in more intimate and personalized ways.
Chris, is there a program you would keep?
I could talk for a long time about programs I'd probably keep, so I don't think I need to add. Maybe like public schools, like I'm a big fan of those, it turns out. Yeah, there's a lot of other ones, but yeah.
I don't know. I guess we're running out of time. I would privatize both Social Security and the public school system. And if you don't like that, well, yeah, I would definitely do that. But you can voucherize a lot of this too. So, I mean, in the public school case, you could say, look, we don't have a sort of geographic monopoly on schooling in the way that we currently do. We just let schools compete. And if parents don't have enough money to send their kids to a school, you just give them vouchers. And we have systems that approximate something like this. And I think the voucher model, so you talked about housing, so you give housing vouchers, or another example. I mean, SNAP is in some sense a voucher. And so just as a general model, I think voucher systems are pretty good. The issue is that, and Romina has talked about this, I mean, that most social spending is essentially for, social insurance for the middle class. And that's what I don't like. What I like is social spending that actually targets people in need. And there is some of that, but I think there is a misconception that that's most of it. It's just not.
Okay. Going back online.
Great. Thanks. So I have a question from Charles Robinson online, and this also connects a little bit with some of the Republican conceptions of liberty and the impact of these programs on our communities. But let me just read his question. Why is there no recognition of the damage these programs do to the fabric of our communities? If one who is able-bodied and able-minded gets all the money they need from the government, then they no longer need their neighbors. No need to go to someone and ask how to plug in productively. Just, I have all I need. I do not need you. It does not help build the dependencies and relationships that allow people to know and appreciate one another. So I guess Charles would just love to hear your thoughts about that concern that he has.
Too worried about that? I mean, you could certainly imagine situations where, social benefits are so high that people unplug entirely to, like I said, surf or whatever, people watch TV, whatever. But, I think that would be more of an issue with the design of transfer spending than transfer spending as such. You could just say, like, look, any sort of reasonable system is going to take incentives into account. And this means making sure that we have a situation where people aren't dropping out from the labor force or community life entirely.
Hi, I'm Adam Rizai. I'm with Davidson Day School. In your perfect version of our government, is the development of a national and universal healthcare system out of the question?
You can look at national universal healthcare systems and see how well they work. You can look at Canada, you can look at the United Kingdom. And if you like government rationing, then you're going to love those systems. If you love waiting sometimes for months before you can get an MRI for an injury you sustained, to the point where treatment is basically pointless because you've been waiting so long, then, it's like, are you actually able to access the healthcare that you need, and at what cost? I don't think the US healthcare system is very well structured. We need a lot of improvements in the way we do healthcare in the United States, but a nationalized system is not the solution. It introduces more problems. We should have a more decentralized system where patients, consumers have more power than health insurance companies, that where your health insurance is not tied to your employer due to some historical accident because the government imposed price controls after World War II. I mean, that to me is absurd. If you kind of look at insurance, you want to diversify risk. And the only reason we have Medicare is because we tied people to health insurance to their employers, such that when you were no longer employed, when you were too old to work or you retired, all of a sudden you were out of health insurance. And that's at a point in your life where you are the most expensive to cover. So if your health insurance wasn't tied to your employer and you could just carry it with you throughout your life, if it was more individual, then we wouldn't even need Medicare, because you would just have your health insurance from birth to death, or switch it up if you want. But there's a lot. The whole system is messed up in the United States as a result of that. But yeah, sorry.
Well, I mean, if you want to diversify risks, healthcare for all is the best way to diversify risks. It's the largest pool of risks, and there's a very strong difference between universal health insurance and having a federal agency that provides your own health care. Like in the UK, most places that have universal health insurance have for-profit companies all the way up and down the scheme. They're regulated in a certain sort of way. You mentioned Canada. I mean, a lot of these countries have really quite good, in the grand scheme of things, health outcomes. I mean, I feel like we've just sort of passed over 30 years of like healthcare economics in the last like sort of like discussion, but yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if we can. I mean, most of them were a product of the post-war era. They were a product of social solidarity in a certain sense. They were a product of a different sort of configuration of power. And so whether you could do it or not, physically you could do it. It wouldn't be hard to pass the law to do it. You could do it well. You could do it crappily, but.
Around healthcare that we might talk about is universal and national. I mean, the vaccine example is one example of that. Maybe we think hard about the quality of birthing in the US and think about how to make that universal and national. One of the things that I worry a lot about in terms of health insurance being tied to employment is the structure of the labor market has changed dramatically, and it's not going to go back, right? And so there's a lot of uncertainty in the structure of that labor market, a lot of more flexibility in what jobs are these days. AI is coming on board. So how do we map that arrangement of anything tied to work, given that the structure of the labor market is shifting so much? And so that does tilt again towards this other option. And the question is, how do you design this option? I think, that's on the table.
Do you want us to call it, or Chris, did you want to?
I mean, 20 seconds. So yeah, so universal healthcare can mean a lot of different things. The big problem with socialized medicine is that it does not innovate. So if you look at where the vast majority of pharmaceutical innovation is coming from, it's the United States. And it's because we're actually paying for the price of these drugs, and then other countries free ride off of American medical innovation. And so at the very least, this is a trade-off that we have to take very seriously when we're talking about universal or socialized medicine.
All right, so we're basically at time. So I want to, invite you all to thank our panelists for an amazing evening. And I've got some more thank yous in a moment, but I've first got a couple of reminders of upcoming events and opportunities to continue to engage with these questions and other questions. So like I said, originally, we have a community conversation back here in this room, February 25th, 7 p.m. Hope you all come back, and we'll have tables. We'll have an opportunity for you guys to build on this conversation. Take it in the direction you want to. You disagreed with something that was up here. You agreed. Share, discuss with each other. So really hope that you'll come, and you can scan that QR code right there. Adam is popping the link in the chat for our online friends to sign up. That one is just in person, but if you're local, you can come out and join. And so hope you see you at that. February 19th, next Thursday night, we have a very special event. So we are hosting Bridge USA, which is a national network of over 120 chapters on college campuses across the country to change and improve our politics with one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing, youth social movements in the country. And their CEO, Manu Meal, is going to be joining us for an event that we're calling Why Deliberate? And we're going to have an interactive debate with Manu and several Davidson students to really engage with the question, like, and take it seriously. Why deliberate? And the concerns that people have, the resistance, the hesitation, and put it on the table and have a discussion about it and have audience participation and engagement. And so you'll get to hear from Manu, who's an amazing speaker, and also Davidson students up here on the stage. And then there'll be, in the second hour, we'll have some food. We're gonna actually have Chipotle here, some delicious, delicious food. And then the second hour will be a workshop on the Bridge USA workshop on how to engage in dialogue with your friends, your family members, who you may have some pretty deep disagreements with. How do you do that, right? If you think it's important, but just not sure how, that's a great opportunity to come out and learn from Bridge USA. And so this is hosted by the DCI, by the Center for Community Engagement, and the Institute for Public Good. And we really want everybody to come out for that conversation. So that's next Thursday, 5 to 7, right here, 900 room. And then Adam, bust out the next one. All right, and then February 26th, we also have Davidson and Enduring Values, Davidson's 5 living presidents, where we here to talk about what are Davidson's enduring values. And these are all amazing people. I know them all, and I think they're fantastic. And I'm really excited about this event, and I think you'll really all enjoy it. So it's and you need to get tickets because there's going to be a lot of people wanting to go. So if you're interested, get a ticket today. And then also want to sort of give a shout out and reminder about our next and final forum in the series, which is going to be at Duke University, but it will be streamed online, and we'll have a watch party here in Hans Auditorium on March 24th. They are finalizing their panelists, and we'll be able to share that very soon. But I think it's going to be an amazing event. So watch out for more information about that. And then I want to thank all of you for being here, for being out here on an evening. There's a lot of other things you could be choosing to do, but this is the work of democracy, of citizenship, and of deliberative citizenship specifically. And, like I was in a conversation earlier today about, the grant that Chris mentioned over lunch. And it's like, why did we get this grant? Like, why? It was very competitive. A lot of schools, wanting to, get $4 million to do civil discourse. Why did we get it? Probably a little bit of luck, but it's also because of, again, all of you, right? And all the support that we've had from the college, from President Quillen, from President Hicks, to all the faculty who've incorporated DCI, D teams, and forums into their courses, to all the student fellows. Student fellows, please raise your hands. Who have been trained in how to facilitate these deliberations, right? To our community members and alumni who have come out for these events. You all helped us build a 6-year track record of doing this work as, before it was popular, right? And we've learned a lot along the way. And so we couldn't do it without you. We can't do it without you. And so I want you all to just give yourselves a round of applause for being here and doing this work. And with that, please enjoy the food and each other's company, and we are adjourned.